But anyway, let's move on to the last topic of the panel, and it's regarding us Spurs fans. And I'm looking at you here, Dave. No, I'm joking. It's like, do Spurs criticise too much? And, you know, this is off the back of the Big Delhi interview this morning. I don't know if you all saw it, but, you know, really, really brave of Delhi to come out and to say what he actually did, as well as, you know, Tanguy Ndombele, who Spurs fans love to pile on, Eric Dyer as well, David, and also Kieran Trippier as well, who was chased out the door back when Spurs did sell him, and he's come back and made himself one of the best, if not the best, right back in the Premier League. So we'll start off with you on this one, HG. Do you feel like Spurs fans love a scapegoat and love to pile on and criticise a bit too much?
As long as I can remember, Spurs fans have always had a scapegoat. I mean, even like the only thing I knew about Mitchell Thomas was that he was rubbish, and this is the late '80s. Do you know what I mean? Like I'd never seen Mitchell Thomas play, but for some reason it had filtered down that Mitchell Thomas was the reason we lost games. It was unfair then. I'm sure it's unfair now. Like I've always thought, there's a difference between a fan and a supporter, right? And a supporter understands that you go to the game to watch Spurs. You want to see them win, you hope they win, you cheer them on so they can win, but there's no expectation that you're going to do it, whether you're playing Luton Town or Manchester United. You understand there is more chance you're going to beat Luton Town, but you still have to do something. You have to make it happen. They won't just roll over for you. And I think that the criticising now that we see from fans rather than supporters is more, every little thing gets overanalyzed, and obviously we're doing it right now. So like I'm just as to blame as anyone else out there. But I do wish personally that football fans in general, not just Spurs fans, but football fans in general, understood that even though you're paying a lot of money to watch these people play and they're earning a lot of money to do so, your job is not to criticise in those 90 minutes. And even outside of that, it doesn't hurt you to be a bit optimistic that, you know, maybe the player didn't play well because of X, Y, Z. That's not necessarily finding an excuse. It's just understanding that there are 11 players on the other side who are going to stop your players from playing their best football. It's not something you can do by yourself. There are very few footballers in world football who have the ability to play well regardless of the opposition. They don't exist. Højbjerg is another one of those. Like we've seen him play really, really well for Spurs. We've seen him play really, really well for Denmark. But if it doesn't happen every week, suddenly he's not very good. I don't understand that logic. So I think fans in general, not just Spurs fans, but I do think fans in general are a bit too quick to criticise.
Well said, HG. And Dave, what's your say on the topic? I mean, you look at the interview that Dele Alli did, and you just don't know what goes on behind closed doors sometimes. And fans just look at what's going on the pitch and heavily criticise or heavily comment on what's going on the pitch. But do you think maybe fans should just take a pause on that a little bit, because we don't know what goes on behind closed doors?
Look, first of all, really emotional interview by Dele Alli, and you know, all my compassion and sympathy towards the guy and any sort of professional footballer that, you know, goes through that, because it's not like me, right? We all go through stuff, and if I went through something, I can just close my door, close my curtains, and I can just sit behind closed doors. Where these guys still have to turn up to train. If they're picked for match day on the bench, they still have to sit there in front of the whole world, right? So I do have a bit of compassion and empathy in that regard. But how are fans supposed to know what's going on when everyone in football close ranks? There's no transparency in football anymore. Everyone's hiding behind an NDA. Everyone's hiding behind an agent. Everyone's hiding behind something, you know. And what we're seeing is back when my lads started supporting football, this, that, and the other, players were more personable. You knew exactly sort of what was going on, and you could maybe understand why some performances were happening. But in this day and age, when everyone's closing ranks, what do you expect fans to do if they don't know what's going on? At the end of the day, you can't blame fans. And look, for me as well, I think you can even throw Sanchez into this conversation, right? But the players that you've listed there, Dyer, Dele Alli, Ndombele, Sanchez, it's not like we get on their back after one performance. It's after a string of a few years of bad performances. And that's the difference. And as a football fan of the club, I don't see why we can't criticise performances. We should be able to criticise performances. You know, we work hard during the week and everything else to be able to go to games, be able to buy the games on TV, which also cost a lot of money, which go towards their wages. And at the end of the day, they're representing every fan's dream. And I don't see why you can't criticise them on their performances. Everything else outside of that, it's not right. But on their performances on the football pitch, they should. It's the nature of the beast. It's always been the nature of the game. That you play well, you get adored. You play bad over a period of time, the criticism comes out. And also, we got to remember on the flip side, when we're doing well, like we were under Pochettino, this Spurs fan base makes up more songs about their players to adore them than any other club across world football. So for me, it's you play well, the good comes, you play bad, the criticism comes. And at the end of the day, we're talking about elite level sport here. Elite level sport is performance based. If they're not performing, criticism naturally comes. And they're highly compensated for it as well. I know it doesn't make everything all okay, but as fans, if a player isn't putting it in on the football pitch, I think we have a right to criticise, because you've got to remember, not all the time is it because of other things that's happened in their life or mental health issues. Sometimes it is because the way they live their life. Sometimes it is because they just have a shit attitude towards it. Sometimes it is because they're just not as committed to football as you may want them to be, like Asto Akoto's case at Tottenham Hotspur. It's not always down to problems off the field. There are other times where players just don't give a bollocks. And the thing is, at Tottenham, we've seen it too much over the last 4 years. Players not performing too long. And as a fan, when it's my release, it's what I love, and it's the only thing I really adore in life. I get let down. I get frustrated. It's just natural that, you know, you end up criticising performances. And I don't think that should be lost, because being brutally honest, you know, if I wasn't criticised sometimes growing up, how do I expect to be better? How do I expect to want to be better? Sometimes criticism you can use as a motivation rather than looking at it and bringing you down all the time. Like I said, I have full sympathy towards players that are going through stuff, because they have to deal with it in a more public manner than anyone else across the world. However, let's not get this mistaken that they haven't been criticised for anything else rather than the longevity of them not performing in the Tottenham jersey. And that's it.
But you know, I think there's a line between criticism and maybe a pile-on, and when it comes too much and it becomes abuse. And I think a lot of our players have suffered that. You know, players being booed on the football pitch. Davinson Sanchez at the back end of last season was on the back of those. So, I mean, there is a fine line, and I think that criticism on the whole, like you're talking about, I think is okay. But I think when it gets more than that, and when it becomes a pile-on, when players start becoming scapegoated week in, week out, and it becomes abuse, that's where the problem really starts, right?
But the thing is, who's scapegoating who? Ndombele has turned up here not fit and hasn't performed. Dyer is out there making mistakes week in, week out. Dele Alli didn't perform at this football club for 2 years. Sanchez, I'd argue, has barely ever performed at this football club. So who's scapegoating who? No one's scapegoating anybody. The reality is their performance just have not been there.
But Dave, don't you think that by pointing it out, you're not helping the situation? Like, I'm pretty certain that when Dyer makes a mistake in front of 60,000 people in the stadium, he knows he's made a mistake. He doesn't need to be reminded of it. I mean, this is it. Like, I don't think anything is really different between how we react as fans now and how we did 30 years ago. Because as much as the money is different, like we're now paying much more than we did, and they're now paying much more than they did, that we would still, at the end of a game, you would say this person didn't play well, that person didn't play well, and it's how the fact that I can get that in any arena now. It's not just me and my mates in the pub. It's not just me and my group that go to the games. I can then do this here. We're all sitting in 3 different countries right now, and we can have these discussions. And so it's everywhere. And so for younger players that have grown up with it, then maybe they understand that pressure is there. But I just think that as fans, as annoyed as we might be, we still have a choice. The choice is, do we really want to criticize, or do we want to say, you know what, the other team did something, or maybe there was a reason why they. I don't consider that making excuses for them. It's just understanding that they are more than just robots that can go out there and do what we want them to do. It's a tough line, because no one wants to criticize too much, and we all feel upset when Spurs didn't win. Me, because maybe I'm more upset that Spurs haven't played to their potential more than the fact we didn't win. right? That's just who I am. But there are people out there who we could win the game 3-1 and would still be saying, "Oh, but we could have had 5." It's a lot to do with personal character, but it's they're criticizing too much. Yes, I do think we criticize too much, but I don't feel as if like people themselves are any different than they were. It's just that we've now got more opportunity to criticize.
But also, it's heightened by social media. Everyone wants more and more of an insight, so that demand is more and more and more, right? So it heightens everything. But
there's more of an insight, and there's more and more of a disconnect as well between the players and the fans. What there was maybe 30 years ago. So in one thing we want more, yet we're getting less.
Yeah. Absolutely spot on, but also I feel like we're entering a bit of a dangerous sort of territory here, because criticism has always been the nature of being in the public eye. It's always been that way. You accept that when you sign them big contracts, that you're going to be out there in the public eye. And you've also got to understand, it's not going to be easy. You know, you are going to go through some trials and tribulations, and there are going to be criticism. But the conversation should not be on the fans, because fans will always let you know if they don't enjoy your performances, but equally they'll also show you the love and the adulation when they do appreciate your performances. Just the conversation should be around. Have the governing bodies, have the clubs moved on to the modern day era where they understand that social media and everything else, it drives that criticism more at the player's door, and stuff like that, and it heightens it. Why can't the conversation be on the governing bodies? Are they doing more for players? How many ex-players have I heard come out with and say there hasn't been enough opportunities once they've finished playing football? There hasn't been this support network, this, that, and the other. And there's been so many players over the last 4 to 5 years that have all come out and sort of said the same thing. After the lights turn off, after you're finished playing football, there's no governing body, there's no one there to help you with the next step. There's no one help you to deal with the depression of not walking out there in front of 60,000 people every single weekend anymore. So the conversation should be more on the governing bodies and the clubs. Are they providing enough to these guys to be able to deal with it, rather than constantly blaming the fans?
But I do think the fans have to take some, not specifically our fans, but I would say more modern day fans who are used to like social media, have to take not responsibility, but have to maybe be more self-aware on how the way we criticize players now affects these players' mental health. Whereas, back in the day, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, when a player had a bad game, there would be a call-in show on the radio, and there may be a column in the newspapers with play ratings, and that would be that. Now you have players making fail compilations. You've got players tweeting, "I never want to see this guy put on a shirt ever again. He's a disgrace." Death threats. All of these things. You've got death threats. You've got all these different things. And Dyer put out a documentary. Spurs put out a documentary on Eric Dyer the other day, a player who served us for 9 years and has been, yes, he's maybe not been the best player over all that whole time, but a lot of the reaction to that documentary was a lot of fans, putting very negative messages about it, and saying how Tottenham shouldn't be putting out documentaries about rubbish players like this. And when it gets to booing in the stadium for a player who hasn't played well, I completely draw the line at that kind of thing. I think it's unacceptable when Ndombele comes back from training and he's does a little stroll to the front door, and everyone are you getting tweets saying he's a disgrace? Look at his body language. I never want to see him put on a Spurs shirt. Look at him. It's like, what are we doing here? Players see that's not criticism of performance. That's just clearly personal things. And I think it can form narratives. This is what I'm trying to getting at. I think in this day and age, it's so easy for fans to form narratives on social media about players. And that's exactly part of what Dele was saying in his interview about how narratives would form from the press and social media about him, which were completely not true. And I think it's very dangerous when fans start to do that kind of thing. And for example, like failed compilations, it's so easy to form a narrative about a player by creating all their worst bits of any given game or any part of any season, and start creating a narrative about how bad this player is when you're very selectively editing, and it's all to serve your own narrative that you're trying to create because you have a personal dislike for that player.
But Sim, if a player doesn't come out and shut things down, that allows the narrative to be formed. That allows the narrative to build. And this is what I'm talking about transparency in football. If a player's going through things, come out and say it. It's a different world now. The amount of support you'll get behind you, this, that, and the other, rather than maybe how it would have been sort of, received maybe, even 10 years ago, where it'd be like, look, mentally he's not up to it, get him out the game. There's a lot more understanding around mental health in this world now. So for me, transparency. They can sit here and blame the fans, the press, and everything else. But they also hide behind closed doors. They hide behind people on their social media accounts. There's no transparency. If they would just come out and be honest, maybe the reaction would be slightly different towards them. There's no point in coming out crying about a narrative being formed when you've allowed it to be formed without coming out and speaking.
I mean, that's a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? Like, if you don't say anything, people will think what they want to think. And if you do say anything, some people will say, well, they're just lying anyway. Like,
well, at least you have it from the horse's mouth, though, right?
Well, it's true. But it's just that people react how they want to react to whatever happens in front of them. Like, I've been a big supporter of Danny Rose. I like Danny Rose. I think what he did and what he said, as much as I didn't like how he did it, I understood the logic behind it. And I quite enjoyed the fact that he was open and honest about how he felt at Spurs. But what happened to him? Right, he was very quickly shunned for doing so, and now he's considered a bit of a figure of fun, sadly. So you can see both sides of it. Like, no one is going to be the first one to voluntarily come out and say, "Hey, I'm struggling," because you know that there are hundreds, thousands of people who will say, "How can you be struggling? You're getting 50 grand a week," and the whole mental side will become irrelevant because lots of people will just, "Hey, if you're struggling, what do you think I'm doing?" It becomes very personal very quickly, and I get that, right? I understand that that's kind of human nature. We do think about number one first, but you would hope, and I think that what we've seen with Delhi today, people are realizing that. I mean, he says it himself in the interview that together you can get through things quicker. So hopefully we'll have this moment today where everyone says, right, you know what? Maybe I'm not struggling right now, or I haven't told people about my struggles, but I'm willing to get out there and do it, just with my friends, with people around me. And then it will grow into being something that everyone is aware that everyone is going through something. And I think that when the world we live in right now, people just assume you can only have issues if you don't have the money to do what you need, regardless of anything else. And hopefully we can get away with this idea that money solves the problems. It can help, don't get me wrong. Yeah. It's not a bad thing to have, but it doesn't mean that you will be problem free and that the problems you have will be minimized. Money can't solve everything. It can help you, but it can't solve it. So it's crazy. Like, I don't know how long it will be until the next player comes out and says it. I suspect it will be longer than it needs to be. But I hope that the four of us together, we're all similar ages, if I can be so bold and say that about myself at least. But you three are similar ages than I want to think I am. But we are going through similar phases in life, whether it's having kids or dealing with pressures of work and the politics involved. Just because Dele Alli has earned much more in his life than I ever will, doesn't mean he's immune to that. And so I hope that Spurs fans will support their own players better. I hope that whatever nationality we are, we support our international players better. And I can only think of one time. One time I was lucky enough to watch Austria play Ireland, oddly enough, in an international here in Vienna. It was a while ago, but I remember Austria won. I'll put that in there. But one of my mates worked for the Football Association, so he got me a VIP ticket, and I was actually sat with the players' families. And at that time, Austria's number 9 was Andy Weimann, who played at Villa and Bristol City for a while. Yeah. And the entire game, you had 50,000, 45,000 Austrians booing every touch. And you know what? Had I been sat somewhere else in the stadium, I may well have joined in, because he wasn't playing well and no one really wanted him to play. He was kind of the manager's favourite son who played, even though no one really thought he should. But where I was sat, just in front of me was Andy Weimann's mum and his little brother with an Aston Villa Weimann shirt on. And I saw it completely differently. That suddenly you saw them as humans. They weren't just these people that are out there playing. You realised that they had families and they had feelings, and that his little brother's going to go to school the next day and probably get teased for it. And that is not a normal thing to happen. I will not get teased for how my brother lives his life. And so I just that changed the way I saw it, and I hope that because of it I've become a bit better. Don't get me wrong, I have my scapegoats too. I have my players that I don't like. I don't think are particularly good, but I will never go past their football ability. To me, it's not what they've done on the pitch. It's their total ability, personal, that kind of gets to me. But who they are as people, I know nothing about them, so I will never go there.
Just off the back of this, where do we sort of draw the line? Because, do you stop talking about players' performances altogether? Ones that are just not good enough to be here. Do you not mention that? You know what I mean? Where do you sort of draw the line where you are allowed to sort of talk about their performances and stuff like that? Because it is relevant. You can't allow, players to stay here on exorbitant wages and not performing. You just can't. You just can't.
Dave, I don't think there's a problem with speaking about players' performances and criticising individual performances. I think, like I said before, where the problem lies is where, it gets way over the top. It's like, this guy's a shit guy, get him out of the club. Everyone's everyone's culpable of it. Everyone's done it before. I've done it before. And I'll probably do it again, to be honest. But that's where it shouldn't be done. And when it becomes a pile-on and when it becomes abuse, when it becomes real abuse directed at one certain individual, I think that's when it gets way too much. And in terms of booing inside stadiums, I completely disagree with that. I've only ever booed two players, one player in a Spurs shirt before, and that was Hossam Ghali, because he threw the shirt down at Martin Yole. And I refuse to boo a player in a Spurs shirt. I think it's way over the top.
Look, as I said earlier on, I don't condone the abuse, but let's not fall into a narrative where you can't criticise a player's performance without it being taken that you're piling on a player, this, that, and the other, because it's not always necessarily the case. Sometimes, you're allowed to criticise a performance without it being a pile-on. That's all I'm trying to say. When it comes to abuse, it's too far. But the reality is, in life, you always have some mindless idiots that take it that far. And there's nothing that the rest of us shouldn't be chastised for it. Yes, you can bring awareness and stuff like that, but we're now talking about mindless idiots who take it too far. But we should still be sitting here allowed to criticise a player's performance if it's not good enough.
Yeah, and I think that's fair enough. I just think we have to keep in mind all the time, like when you speak about players, obviously I think when it comes to purely footballing performance and footballing level and all that kind of stuff, I think that is fair game. I don't think we should sit here and say this guy played well when you don't believe that. But I think when it gets to getting more personal and things like that, which I think a lot of fans cross that line, and when it gets to as well, like rubbing players' face in how bad they've done, and really trying to let them know that they for example, making I remember when Lo Celso was going through a bad period of Tottenham, there was a Twitter account just making compilations just of every mistake he made, and he ended up blocking that account. But clearly that stuff gets seen by players, and there's really no need for that.
What about Emerson Royale? When Emerson first came to this club, he was getting booed at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium for having poor performances. And yes, fine, he took a while to adjust, but since he's adjusted to the Premier League and adjusted in a Spurs shirt, people, I wouldn't say love him, but are liking him at the moment, and nobody really wants him sold at the moment. And that opening period of when he was adjusting to life at Tottenham was nowhere near good enough from this fan base. Nowhere near good enough, and it's happened many a time. So those are the moments that I'm talking about as well.
I'm not saying if a guy loses his man and you think he's at fault for a goal, and you can say that, it's fine. You can call people out for mistakes or you not think they're good enough. But I think there is a line to be drawn to personal attacks, getting to their personality, who talking about their attitude and things like that, unless it's really apparent, talking things that people don't really know about. And as well, I just think continuously, there are accounts dedicated just continually attacking players, and that must really pull away on some of these players sometimes.
Yeah, no, 100%.